Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this conversation, going through the post-COVID economic crisis, a global South perspective. First, I want to thank Dejusticia and the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights for hosting this dialogue in a time when the South perspective is increasingly relevant. For English speakers, you can follow the conversation in the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights YouTube channel. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us in the conversation, going through the post-COVID economic crisis as well as perspective. First, I want to thank but if you want to follow in Spanish, you go to Justicia's YouTube channel in a time when the South perspective is increasingly. Now, I would like to welcome our three speakers who for the next hours are going to share with us their perspective. First, Alejandro Rodriguez, researcher economist specialized in fiscal policy and human rights issues for Dejusticia in Colombia. Welcome, Alejandro.
Thank you very much, Lourdes, and very glad to be here with Atul and Salma. This is very important space to share with Global South actors.
Thank you, Alejandro. Then we have Salma Hussein, a senior researcher for the Eipr on social and economic justice. She's joining us from Egypt. Welcome, Salma.
Hello. Thank you, Lourdes. I'm really happy to meet with you all and looking forward to hear what you are going to say.
Thank you, Salma. And third, and last but not least, Atul Sot. He is a professor of economics at the JNU in India. Welcome, Atul.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here with everyone. Especially grateful to the two institutions in Colombia and in Egypt for asking me to come with the Indian perspective this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Atul. Well, I want to start with our dialogue, and I would like for you, the three of you, to go back to the end of last year or the beginning of this year before the COVID-19 pandemic strike. What was the context in either of your regions or countries? Which were the most social and economic challenges you were facing? How we characterize the role of the state and the fiscal policy addressing these challenges? I would like to start with Alejandro, please.
Thank you, Lourdes. I'm going to share my presentation. Please let me know when you can see it. Okay. Okay. So I would like to start just talking about the environment of Latin America prior to the crisis. The context in the region of South America was one of political and social tension. In one hand, protests in different countries of the region surged in the last months of 2019. People in countries like Chile, Ecuador, or Colombia went out to the street in a massive way for several weeks. Although the reasons that initiated these protests were different across countries, the demand for social justice and better living conditions and the clear rejection of social and economic inequality were common causes that could be identified in these protests. This could be explained by the social conditions of the region. If you can see in the graph, millions of people currently live in situation of systematic violations of economic social rights, as the right to the highest attainable standard of health, the right to education, and the right to adequate food. An important fraction of the population in the region still live in poverty despite the high economic growth and the region experienced in the early years of 21st century. that were generated by the commodity boom. These gains were never distributed through society, reinforcing inequality in the region. As we can see in the graph that I'm showing, the region of Latin America is one of the highest inequality, has one of the highest inequality levels in the world. As you can see, all the countries that in Latin America, they are with the blue is not strong. So that means that the levels of inequality are very, very high in the region. So this situation was accompanied by the election of new right-wing leaders in Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Uruguay, and Brazil that further threaten the weak social protection systems and the fiscal capacity of these countries. The latter is especially important if one considers that the fiscal space that Latin America...
Can I ask you a favor? Can you expand your presentation? Thank you.
Oh, sorry. So, as we can see, this later is very important. As you can see in the graph, the fiscal space that Latin American countries have is very narrow. If we compare the tax revenues of the Latin American countries and you compare with the OECD countries, there is a difference about 11 points difference. So you can see that these differences are very large. So countries did not have the available resources to develop or expansive social protection measures and safety net measures. As well, fiscal policy does very little to reduce inequality in the region, while OECD countries reduce their Gini coefficient after tax and transfers by an amount of approximately 16%. The region of Latin America does it only in 2%. So after the crisis, the fiscal space was very narrow, and there is context of high inequality that made the region very vulnerable to the pandemic.
Thank you, Alejandro. Can Salma please share their context? Turn on your mic, please, Salma.
So it's interesting to see that inequality in Latin America and Colombia are driving people to the streets, because actually this is what pretty much is there in our region too. So pre-COVID-19, the Middle East was known as the most unequal region in the world. If you compare it to India, Brazil, Sub-Saharan Africa, Canada, and Europe, you can see that the top 10% in the Middle East were holding 61% of the income. This is due to between country inequalities. So if we see the at one extremity the rich Gulf small countries, and on the other side Yemen, Sudan, Iraq, Syria, and all the beaten torn due to war or due to instability and other reasons for occupation, like in Palestine. So to cut it short, we have a lot of inequalities within each country and also between the countries of the region as well. When it comes to Egypt, this is the wealth, the evolution during the 21st century You can see the curve mounting. So Egypt is one of the top 10 unequal in the world in terms of wealth. We can say that the wealth increased by 13% in the 21st century, and the slight decrease lately is due to devaluation of the pound. So that's why when it's valued in dollars, it looks like as if it's a little bit less. The top 10% share in income was 49% versus the bottom 50% of the population holding 18% only of income, almost equal of the share of the top 1%. So why, where does it come from, all this inequality? Along the years, with all the globalization and the deregulation, we saw the wages as a share of GDP coming down to less than 25% now, versus profits of more than 70%. So there's a continuous shift of income from the labor to the capital happening. Also, when we see how the budget is managed, how it's covered, how the revenue, which revenue covers the expenditures, we see that there is a shift from taxes to public debt. In Egypt, taxes account for like 13% of the GDP. It covers only barely 1/3 of the expenditure. The rest is covered by actually public debt. A third reason we can see is, like the World Bank was describing it in 2014, there is a case of state capture where the business elites, before the 2011 revolution, they were like in alliance with the Mubarak family, barely 1/3 of the expenditure. They were joining the ruling. Now they substituted these ties by ties with the army and with high officials. So this enabled them to capture lots of rents from public resources, from the public revenue, and a lot of other rents as well. We can also notice that there are strong ties between these business elites and the Arab leaders through private and sovereign funds. So we've always, as youngsters, dreamt of Arab regional integration. I think there is now one, but only among the top 1%, you know. This situation actually led to what they call selective authority. We have banks and businesses who lend the government at exceptionally high interest rates in whatever the circumstances are. Now and we have also wages, and I mean, this is for one part, they capture a lot of public funds through lending the government. On the other side, we see, for instance, the government has to cut wages, public wages, to teachers, to public servants, and everywhere else. But this is not for all the public servants, because high officials, they keep their incomes hidden in off the budget funds where they get all their bonuses. If we look at also, for instance, like energy subsidies, we'll see that 80% of energy subsidies in Egypt is one of the largest and the most generous countries in giving energy subsidies. 80% of these are captured by large corporates that are very well linked to the system. So, well,
thank you, Salma. Please, Atul.
Thank you, Protest, for asking me to come in. And I'm happy that I'm coming in after my co-panelists have already sketched the context in their regions. What I'm going to talk about is the social, economic, and policy context in India, particularly since June 2019. So I'm not going to go back in history too much. The reason I've chosen June 2019 is because the current government came to power in that particular month. I would like to talk about four things very briefly: the key legislations and the political context, the aggregate macroeconomic indicators, the labor market conditions, and fourth, the policy perspective that informed the government in terms of its economic and social policy. On key legislations, when 6 months after June, that is in December, January, when the performance of this government was being evaluated, the pink pages and sections of Indian society and those in the government circles were quite euphoric and hailed the first 6 months as a period of phenomenal achievement by this government. It was supposed to have brought the nation closer to the idea of nation, one flag, and one constitution. And the evidence for this was the following. There was a bill to abrogate Article 370, which was a temporary provision for the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Indian Parliament approved a bill that makes Muslim practice of instant divorce a criminal offense. The Supreme Court of India passed an order where it handed over so-called a disputed mouse client to the Hindu, and the government of India took the responsibility of constructing the Hindu temple. This land was under dispute since the 18th century, and the resolution, so-called, was brought about by a Supreme Court order very recently. And along with these three things, the Citizenship Amendment Act was passed on 12 December 2019. The act says that all non-Muslim persecuted minorities from Bangladesh, Pakistan, Afghanistan, meaning Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Christians, will be given asylum in India. So by default, the Citizenship Amendment Act will ensure that those deprived of citizenship as a result of persecution will only be Muslims. With the passing of these bills, the country experienced massive protests. The protest against the CAA, there were other acts as well, the National Register of Citizens and the National Population Register, created really an immense response or immense protest across the country. The attempt to split the country on religious lines were actually greatly resisted, and it brought about people in unity in defense of the secular Indian constitution. The protests also produced a new narrative of equal citizenship, throwing a formidable challenge to the narrative of a communalized, muscular Indian state. The young men and women, particularly the Muslim young men and women and the working class women, claimed full citizenship to this country, setting aside all burdens of partition in the subcontinent, as well as the creation of the Hindu nationalist distorted worldview. They read the preamble of the constitution every day, they waved the Indian flag and sang the songs of unity. These nationwide protests came to an abrupt halt in the fires of brutal communal conflagration in parts of Delhi in the last week of February, followed by a nationwide lockdown due to the COVID-19 pandemic a month later. So this was the social and the key legislative and the political context. On the economic front, right after this government came to power, it claimed that India very soon become a $5 trillion economy. It is currently a $2.7 trillion economy. So to almost double the size of the current economy in 5 years, it naturally claimed that it needed to make major policy initiatives. And the key role that the government adopted for itself was to create an investor-friendly ecosystem, including corporate tax cuts and privatizations of public sector units. Before the spread of COVID, there was also acknowledgement across all quarters that the situation of GDP in India was very challenging. And GDP growth in India in the 2 quarters of 2019-20 was just 5% compared to 6.8 in the previous years, 7.2 in the previous years, and 8.2 in the year before. So the economy was really slowing down. The understanding of this slowdown was that the private investment has stalled in the Indian economy. the consumption was muted, and exports were barely growing. So with the squeeze in the global demand, slowing down of private final consumption expenditure, the engine that was pulling the Indian economy in this period was just the government expenditure. Interestingly, in spite of this public discourse about how government expenditure was the engine of growth or the fulcrum of growth, there was unease to use government expenditure to give push to the economy. And this was reflected in the budget documents and in the parliaments. And essentially for the reason that the governments no longer believe in taking the responsibility for the welfare of its own citizen as their first priority, and they dislike the idea of an interventionist state and are more concerned about issues of productivity, efficiency, and output. In terms of the labor market, pre-COVID unemployment in India was an all-time high, 6.1% compared to 2 to 3% over the last 4 decades. More and more workers were withdrawing from the labor force. There was a discouraged worker effect. About 75% of people who were, bulk of the employment, either self-employed or casual labor. Organized sector employment was very small. About 75% of these engaged in self-employment and casual employment were actually earning less than the minimum wages. And finally, the 2019 report, the Global Index, put India at 102 out of 117 countries. This score is based on 4 parameters: undernourishment, child wasting, share of children under the age of 5 who are wasted, and child stunting, and child mortality under 5. In fact, in the most vulnerable provinces or regions of India, 22% respondents reported missing a meal in the past 3 months. So this is the larger context of the labor market, situation of hunger, social and economic context, and clearly there is a direct link between hunger and disease and the COVID-19 and the sudden lockdown and its impact on the economy exposed and magnified this underbelly of India's social reality in exponential terms.
Thank you, Atul. Thank you to Salma and Alejandro. What we can see is that prior to the pandemic, the Global South had a very challenging context characterized by levels of inequality, poverty, hunger, and also by captured states with weak and insufficient fiscal policies to guarantee the rights of their citizens, but strong to serve the elite's interests. All of this has caused a different manifestation of social and political unrest and the degradation of democracy. In this point, I would like to say to our audience, if they have any questions or speakers, let us know in the chat of the YouTube streaming, please. And now going back to the discussion, taking into account the complexities of the context in each of your regions or countries, for speakers, what are the most significant impacts that are expected due to the pandemic? And so far, which has been the government's response to mitigate such impacts? This response has included any significant change in the fiscal policy? For this question, I would like to start with Salma, please.
You want me to start?
Yes. Yes, please. We are going to change the order, make it more dynamic.
It was interesting that actually the government ignored totally the COVID. And actually made like an inverted response. It helped more the poor than before, and helped less it helped more the rich, and it helped less the poor. So anyway, when COVID hit, the first reaction was to borrow. Already MENA is the fastest external borrower in the past few years, and it was propelled basically by Egypt, which its external debt grew by 17% in 2018. So when COVID came, there was already this trend, but it was exacerbated. So borrow. Egypt became this year the second largest client for the IMF after Argentina. Domestic debt also increased. And as I said before, Egypt provides the highest return on T-bills in the region and maybe second or third worldwide. So it's very lucrative for investors to lend Egyptian government. And Egypt, unlike Argentina, has a very good track record of paying back the debts so far. So the high interest rate reflects partially the rentier factor, because of the banks, the power of the banks and the big businesses in order for them to capture lots of rents. So already before COVID-19, 7 in every 10 working in the private sector are informally employed. So no legal contracts, no sick leaves, no vacations, no legal hours, no health, or social insurance. So in this situation, when of vulnerability, when COVID hit, half women and 2/3 of men were affected deeply. 1 in 4 lost their jobs, and it's predicted that more 1.2 million unemployed will join the unemployment force in 2020. 3/4 of the people who are working had witnessed income losses and or work less hours. When it comes to poverty, it's expected by the end of 2020 that a huge number, between 5 and 12 million people would will fall under the poverty line. We had already the highest percentage of poverty at 34% 2 years ago, because of a very harsh economic program led by the IMF experts, which raised the hunger and the poverty by record numbers. So we had also over 6 million people in hunger due to the devaluation of the pound, which lost half of its value abruptly. And Egypt was already among, according to the World Bank, among the highest 35 countries in all the 4 aspects of malnutrition. So now that Egypt, as I told you, borrowed again from the IMF and is engaged in a new reforms. I can't call them reforms actually, because they're not reforming anything. Actual program under the IMF, we're expecting a new devaluation with the economic crisis, and then expecting a new an increase, a surge in hunger as well. We found in this we have a very valuable study made by the official statistical bureau in Egypt. It was for covering the period from March to June 2020, so the first 3 months of lockdown in Egypt. So already the 9 lowest income deciles reported that decreased their food expenditure, they decreased the quality and the quantity of food they are consuming. So it's and also all the figures of the people who lost their jobs and incomes are from the same study. So what is the government response towards all this alarming situation? Actually, they lessened the food subsidy allocation. They decreased it by a huge amount. In Egypt, we don't have unemployment benefits, and despite the issue was brought during the breakout of the first months of the breakout of the COVID-19, it was like buried and never talked about again, and never translated into budget allocations. Actually, Egypt has a program of cash transfers, but they witnessed almost no increase in the allocation, and the government actually adopted an exit scheme for people who so they are like aiming to reduce the number of beneficiaries, or at least substitute families with others during the COVID. Health expenditure to GDP is among the lowest in 8 years this year, and despite an increase of 20 million pounds, we can only track 1/4 of this amount of money. The rest still unspecified. We don't know what will the government spend, how will the government spend this money. That's just a glimpse of the expenditure side. As for the revenue side, we saw on somewhat positive note, lower income tax on the lower income brackets, but we saw on the other side more stamp taxes, VAT expanded on goods that were before excluded, and higher fees on hundreds of public services provided by the government and indispensable services. We saw also exemption of taxes on property for corporates. We saw property tax freeze for 6 months, capital gain tax annulled and abolished for good now, tax avoidance. We have a situation where it's the norm in the private sector, actually where the large corporates have a network of havens, tax havens, whether in Gulf Emirates, in Cyprus, all the small islands of the British, under the British crown, and also via European countries and the US. So it's like a very sophisticated schemes of tax avoidance that are there, and none not fought against. So that was the response, and I'm looking forward to hear the rest of you what happened.
Thank you, Salma. Now Atul, please.
Thank you. So you asked me to talk about two things. One is the impact, and the other is the response. Indian Parliament just 2 days ago had said that no data is available on job losses and deaths amongst the migrant workers in India. So therefore, they are unable to provide any compensation. So what the discussion that I am going to do today, unfortunately, is still not without facts. I have a lot of facts to quote. Indian Parliament did not have those. The slowing down and the exodus from the cities in India, just as this unprecedented lockdown was announced, was visible and witnessed within the first few hours and the first 2 days in the whole country. And the grim economic reality of the vast majority of Indian working people was in full public view and under full public discussion. Within days of the lockdown, it was quite evident that this sudden lockdown was a catastrophe rising on an already crippled economy, which I had talked about in the first segment. In fact, the government acknowledged this reality, and on the second day of the lockdown itself, that is on March 26th, the Finance Minister of India announced a package for 1,70,000 crores to stimulate the economy. As it is now confirmed by experts, and was stated then also, that this package was totally oblivious to the kind of situation that was developing on the ground. The betrayal of the faith in the package, not surprisingly, sparked off immense fear and insecurity as poor people realized that they were on their own and the government was not with them. So they packed whatever little belongings they had and began leaving cities for their villages, marching silently hundreds of kilometers along the highways and railway tracks. In fact, a recent June 2020 study says that 200 migrant workers lost their lives while walking and cycling back home, traveling in cars and scooters, and in mass fatality crashes involving state buses as well. So what the country witnessed was workers escaping the cities while the cities turned the back on them. And the state was violating laws with impunity. Two laws: one, the the regulation of employment and conditions of service of migrant workers, and the other, the Disaster Amendment Act. Under the former act, the government is obligated to provide wage payment and journey allowance to and from the home state. And under the Disaster Act, the government has the responsibility of providing provisions in the relief camp for food, drinking water, medical cover, and sanitation. Both these acts were violated through impunity as the world and India witnessed on the television screen this mass exodus of the working people. In fact, people started comparing this exodus with the partition of the subcontinent in the 1947. Later on, people realized that no, because that was the pandemic had a very huge bias towards the poor, which is typically unexpected of the pandemic. So it was not like the partition exodus of people. COVID does not make a distinction between migrant laborers, women, middle class, affluent cities, and rural people, but the impact of COVID does. So the disease or the pandemic doesn't, but the impact does. All this was captured in numerous surveys, and there are detailed accounts available of the extent of hunger and the extent of deprivation that people experienced, particularly the homeless, the marginalized, the destitute, single women, and so on. I'm not providing that data. At the aggregate level, growth forecasts for the fiscal 2021 have now been revised. It was earlier said that India would be growing at -5%. Now the credit rating agencies are saying India is expected to grow at -9%. Expectation is that there will be a permanent loss of 13% of real GDP over the medium run in India. In nominal terms, this amounts to about 30 lakh crores of Indian rupees. 1 lakh is 1 trillion and 1 crore is 10 million. So this is much bigger than the 3% permanent hit to GDP that the Asia Pacific economies, excluding India and China, are expected to experience over the medium run per the S&P credit rating agencies. The pandemic now expanding from the metropolitan areas, going to the smaller cities and rural areas, and the percentage of cases coming from rural areas have suddenly spiked. In the April-June quarter, GDP contracted by 24%. But that did not come as a surprise, as the indicators were indicating already a deep hit. And there are no expectation that the GDP is going to recover to their levels, as I earlier said, anywhere soon. On employment, the latest data by a Center for Monitoring Economy, which is an independent body, states that there has been shrinkage of salaried jobs of unprecedented kinds. In the initial period of the lockdown, it was the informal workers, the small sector workers, the small and medium enterprise workers who had taken the hit. Now it's the plight of the salaried workers which has worsened. And the estimates are that about 18 million people lost their jobs in April, additional 0.1 million in May, followed by some improvement in jobs in June, and again a loss of 5 million jobs, salary jobs, in July. This is in sharp contrast to what is happening in the informal and non-salaried job. Now, the question that I wish to pose and we will need to discuss is, has this context of what existed pre-COVID and what was the impact of COVID made any difference in the thinking of the decision makers and policy makers about what drives the economy? And will the post-COVID policy framework be any way different? What we have seen is that there is no evidence at the moment, as far as the Indian state is concerned, of willingness to invest either in public health or to come up with a massive fiscal stimulus package. None of the old thinking appears to be changing. On May 12th, the government announced a package, but if you go through the nitty-gritties of this package, I'm happy to share the details, one would realize that the package was claimed to be close to 10% GDP, out of which not even 1% of the GDP is actually going to go into pockets. Most of the instruments that are used for the stimulus package are based on measures which deal with liquidity, availability of finance, and basically financial sector and financial market facilitation. The details, the government also justified this by saying that if you look at the mega packages that advanced countries like US or Canada have announced, they are actually a small percentage of those packages. And the examples that were given was the fiscal stimulus package of United Kingdom projected 15% of GDP, but only about 3.7% of that, was in terms of its impact. So the Indian government too, likewise, has evidently hesitated in adopting any direct method of spending money and has relied heavily on financial institutions. Health, my colleagues have talked about health. Health is the best starting point to bring about this change in thinking, but there seems to be no evidence on this. The health system that we have constructed over the last few decades is essentially a health sector based on private sector. It's based on private insurance, and public health and public facilities have been completely compromised. Just half a minute more. If you look at then what have been the policy announcements other than this package, and I want to just list them and not elaborate. Labor reforms have been announced, which is basically rights of labor and space for trade unions. Ordinances in agriculture are announced, which is to do with corporatization of agriculture and handing over India's agriculture to big business. A draft proposal has come for environmental impact assessment norms, which will actually dilute the environmental standards. There is a huge talk about disinvestment in public sector units. So what I'm suggesting is that the crisis, pre-COVID and the COVID impact, the policy framework is actually now suggests that actually disaster has provided an opportunity for neoliberal thinking to push his agenda further and take away people's rights to respond to this policy response.
Thank you. So, Aldo, please, can you share the Latin American context for this question?
Yeah, of course. So I would like to start with the last slide of my presentation, because I think that Latin American region characteristics or the society's characteristics of high inequality, high informality, and very narrow fiscal space made regions especially vulnerable to the pandemic. As we can see, and as I mentioned, the fiscal space was very narrow before the crisis. As well, with the economic lockdowns necessary to stop the spread of the virus, the most vulnerable population was the one who bore the major costs. Informal workers are among the most impacted by social distancing measures, since their income depends on going out to work and on foot traffic. Also, lower income populations have higher prevalence of chronic non-communicable diseases such as diabetes or hypertension, which have been proven to be comorbidities of the virus, putting them at a greater risk. This graph I'm showing, I think that shows, in the case of Colombia, is a photograph of what is happening. Also a photograph of income inequality of the society. But this graph shows the deaths by COVID-19 by socioeconomic stratification. That is a level of desegregation of income in Colombia. And as you can see, the deaths of COVID-19 are focused in the lower income population. So you can see how these impacts are not equitable or distributed in an equitable way in the society. Even though some countries in the region have very restrictive containment measures, like Argentina, Peru, Colombia, or Bolivia, the pronounced fiscal weakness of the state has led to an inability to sustain social distancing measures and a progressive reopening, after which cases and deaths have increased on a daily basis, making Latin America the epicenter of the pandemic. Most of the cases, as I am showing in the graph, as expected, are concentrated in city districts with higher levels of poverty and informal workers. So about the response, the fiscal response of the countries, the response of the Latin American governments, as you can see in the graph that I'm showing, it has been varied. The allocation of resources has been, although in accordance with the amount of fiscal resources available, which, as already mentioned, is truly short. If you see difference between the initial response of the average of Latin American countries, and you compare it with non-Latin American countries, you can see a very, very steep difference between the fiscal response. Most countries have deployed emergency non-conditional cash transfers to vulnerable households, although with a limited coverage, missing out millions of households that have seen their income gone and need state support. There are also programs to protect employment, where the state covers the wages of the labor force, but the resources available are not that very big. So these responses are still lacking coverage as well as magnitude. As you can see in the graph, this is information about cash transfers for informal workers. As you can see, in a lot of countries in Latin America, governments have been adopting measures, but you can see that there are very different differences between countries in the magnitude of these transfers. So you can see the cases of Costa Rica or Guatemala, Dominican Republic, that they are deploying transfers that have a big magnitude, but then you see cases as Colombia or Paraguay that the magnitude of these transfers are very narrow. Finally, most countries have increased their fiscal deficit to respond to the crisis, except for Brazil and Mexico. But this is concerning because these two countries are among the most hit by the pandemic, and they are focusing in the medium term and planning for fiscal austerity measures that are contrary to the recommendations of expanding public spending to protect the minimum core obligations of states regarding human rights of vulnerable people. And this is also in contrary to the objective of stimulating consumption, households consumption, and as a whole, stimulating economic growth. Taxes revenues have seen a strong decrease as well as economic activity. So the majority of recommendations of different institutions and international financial institutions are to expand social expenditure and public expenditure. So it is quite concerning that governments in Brazil and Mexico are thinking on austerity measures that in the majority of cases have strong human rights implications.
Thank you, Alejandro. It seems that for the South, the pandemic has meant a deepening of the inequalities and all the structural problems that we already had. Unfortunately, the response of our state has not been as expected, as all of you have said, and it seems that there continues to be a regressive response instead of one focused of guaranteeing the rights of the most vulnerable population. But despite the fact that the outlook looks very bleak, we can afford to lose hope. So for each one of you, what will be your public policy recommendation to address the pandemics and its effects, and how governments can protect and guarantee its citizens' rights, and especially which should be the priorities in fiscal matters? I know all these issues are complex to address, but we are running out of time. So I would really appreciate if your intervention is less than 4 minutes. So for start, please, Atul, what will be your recommendations?
Yeah, thank you. I'll just continue and take 2-3 minutes from where I left. So the question I want for us to collectively discuss or reflect on is that across continent, we are seeing this experience where this extraordinary situation in the world as a result of this pandemic, the states continue to respond in a manner which actually furthers their interests without really bringing about the welfare of the people. And the answer that I propose for our consideration is that I think that this exceptional situation as a result of pandemic, which is a state of exception, has helped, at least in the Indian context, to Indian state to use the exceptional constitutional provisions or create exceptional legal or institutional provisions for anything or everything which does not suit their interest. So it's essentially the state of exception has created these extraordinary conditions for the ruling elites to actually further their agenda. And the issue that is of interest is, because the examples I gave, that the use of media, the use of other institutional processes, the legal institutions and so on and so forth, are used to construct these exceptional situations, either in terms of development or in terms of people's ideas. So if certain idea does not suit the interest, it is constructed as an exceptional idea. And then through the legislative framework or through the parliamentary framework, this exceptional idea is addressed through exceptional means. So it's interesting that the parties and the will of the people are actually being used to deal with these extraordinary situations such that the larger interests of people are not being met. So my one-line answer to how do we proceed would be that we need to see various provisions are being used to impact the rights and entitlements of citizens, how politics of development is being constructed through the will of the people. And I would just as a last point say that to me, there is a deep connect between the economics and the cultural discourse. And therefore, the way out is to simultaneously focus on, at one level, seeking concessions from the state in terms of the welfare of the people, though I think that the developmentalist state is dead as far as India is concerned, along with political campaigns and mobilizations to protect the universal well-being of people from state authority and abuse. So I think a twin strategy of seeking concessions from the state on developmentalist considerations, which are going to be very limitedly responded to, along with large participation in larger resistance, where these rights and entitlements of people are being taken away, as in the Indian context, where the labor laws have been diluted in favor of the investor, the environmental laws have been, all during the pandemic, environmental norms have been diluted in favor of the investor. Agriculture, the small and landless agricultural laborers really face starvation and take over by big agribusiness and so on.
Thank you so much, Atul. Alejandro, please.
Thank you, Lourdes. I think so. About what governments can do, or which are the policy recommendations. I think that. Sorry, I think I'm having trouble to share my screen. Please let me know if you can see it.
We can see it.
Perfect. So I think that one of the most important policies that governments around Latin America must adopt are social protection programs that counteract the inequitable impacts of the pandemic that will bring millions of people into poverty. For this reason, resources must be prioritized to protect the rights of most vulnerable groups and households. Basic income programs are useful policies to achieve this. It is important then to consider focusing social programs in that direction and combining with existing social programs like non-conditional cash transfers that some countries in the region have like Colombia with Familias en Acción or Brazil with Bolsa Familia. So there is a need to allocate more resources so these transfers can reach all vulnerable, poor or extreme poor households. These emergency transfers that have been adopted in the crisis, I think that they are very important steps towards thinking on these more comprehensive social programs that comply with the state's obligation of the minimum core obligations that states have to protect the adequate standard of the right to an adequate standard of living. These transfers can also address the impacts of the pandemic on women. I think that this is a very important issue because women have been hit harsh as they are overrepresented in vulnerable populations, as in farm workers and population living in poverty. Also because some sectors most hit are sectors intensive in female labor force like education, like the education sector. For example, in Colombia, the unemployment rate for women have reached 25.5% in contrast to the 17% of men. So this means that that states need to create strategies to address this issue and strategies with a gender focus. I think that special transfers to mother heads of households can be policies that can address these issues, as well as retraining programs in different sectors to have more job opportunities for women. Finally, I think that is very important to think in a way to finance all this social spending and indebtedness that some countries in the regions are taking. So tax reforms are needed to raise the tax revenues of Latin American countries in the medium and long term. So the fiscal sustainability can be assured and to deploy these comprehensive measures that I already mentioned. I think that these reforms must be progressive, focusing in the population groups and sectors that were not or are not being hit the most the pandemic. I think that strengthening this idea of fiscal pact in societies is very important, and to focus these tax reforms in principles of solidarity and progressivity. Taxes on capital incomes, wealth taxes, digital taxes, as well as assessing and eliminating some regressive tax incentives that all the countries in the region share are some of the options that government have to face the crisis and the post-crisis that comes with the pandemic.
Thank you, Alejandro. And last but not least, Salma, please, can you share with us some of your thoughts? Salma, I think we lost you. We can hear you, nor we can see your...
Yes, I forgot to unmute, sorry. So, well, I was thinking not only what could Egypt do to counter the pandemic effect, but also what can the global South do? Is there anything that we can do in common? And that was my line of thought when I was preparing the presentation. So let me proceed with the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, now you can see it.
No, we can still see your screen.
Okay, I'll try to share it. But anyway, I always look at Egypt in the 21st century as like the epic model of the unleashed hyper-capitalism of our times, because we don't have a lot of rules governing capitalism and the power structure that evolves around it. So in order to reverse this, or to dismantle this huge power that deprives the people from their fair share of the economy, we should see how to try to dismantle this. In 2011, when the people took to the streets, actually we saw that it did not turn out well. You know, there was like a lot of setbacks. Actually, we realized how the political economy of the country is weighing on its capacities to be a little bit more just and more fair. So yes, I agree with the. I mean, recipes do not differ a lot between here in Egypt or in Colombia or in India regarding taxation, property and capital gains, progressive taxes. We also don't have local elections in the past 20 years. Right to assembly is banished. Right of expression, freedom of press are deteriorating massively. So yes, people should have voice, but also is there something we can do together? I always think of a debt relief package, like a lot of NGOs was around the world are advocating. Also, like I can mention Oxfam, for instance. I read about the initiative, and I think for Egypt, for instance, a debt relief package would allow for a 6% of GDP fiscal space. I also think that a South coalition of some sort should advocate for international taxation. So it's like, if it's done via a coalition, maybe revenues could be allocated in some sort of a South fund, for instance. So they pay their taxes first, and then they settle if they can prove that the money sheltered in tax havens are for good purposes and not for tax avoidance or corruption, money laundering issues. So something of the sort would be maybe very interesting to work on, and it creates a huge fiscal space as well. On food security policies, I don't know what about other countries, but here in Egypt, small farmers are mostly poor. 5 to 6%. I mean, 5 to 6 out of 10 living in rural areas are poor. The percentage is higher even in the south. Egypt still is one of the largest importers of food, but on the other side, it exports the best of its food towards Europe and USA. We have big corporates, a lot of them are from Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Kuwait, in coalitions with Egyptians. They basically exploit small farmers, and they get very generous export subsidies in order to export food to Europe and USA. How sustainable is this? I think food security policies and fighting hunger and extreme poverty would make a very good global South agenda item to look for more cooperation and common policies and coordination. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much, Salma. Thank you to Alejandro and to Atul for their interventions. We have learned a lot from you today. I would like to thank Dejusticia and the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights again for hosting this meeting. And thank you to our audience for dedicating an hour of your time to us. What is clear is the pandemic made an already complex context even more complex, but I think that we are all confident that our countries and our regions can be better. But to reach it, we have a lot of work, even in fiscal matters, in public policies. We have to work and a lot of work to do. Each and all of us can contribute to change things. I think it will be important to continue with these South dialogues in which we can learn from each other's experience. The invitation for closing the event is to continue questioning and contributing. The responsibility to build states and fiscal policies that guarantee rights belongs to everyone. So I would like again to say thank you to our speakers and to our audience, and please be safe, keep being safe, and if you can stay at home, please stay at home. Thank you much, and have a good afternoon or good evening or good morning if you're in Latin America. So thank you so much.